and maybe we'll get going. So, hi everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Australian Sensitive Data Interest Group. This interest group is co-facilitated by the ARDC, the Australian Data Archive, PHRN, and the University of Melbourne. I will begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. Today, I'm joining you from my hometown, on Whadjuk Noongar country. Whenever I acknowledge country, I try to think about what it means to belong to a place, and for the way in which the place that I come from shapes my identity, and I encourage you to do the same. I pay my respect to the elders, past and present, of the Whadjuk Noongar people who care for this land. So this session is being recorded, and I believe will be made available after the session. So just to let you know that by attending the session, you will be recorded. If you don't want to show up in that recording, I'd encourage you to turn off your camera so that you don't pop up. But if you're happy to show up, we love to have cameras on so that we can see people in the audience and engage with you in the discussion. You can see more information about our privacy policy at the link there. The AUSDIG, Australian Sensitive Data Interest Group, has a mailing list. You can sign up from our website. So if you want to sign up and hear about more of these meetings, just scan that QR code and you can sign up then. So I think that's everything you need to hear from me. I'm going to hand you over to our speaker today, who's going to be talking to you about human research and ethics. So I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Martin. Michael is a professor of statistics in the School of Finance, Actuarial Studies and Statistics at the Australian National University. He was chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee at the ANU from 2015 to 2024, so he has lots of experience to talk to us from on this topic. And I'm happy to invite Michael to let us know what he'd like to talk to us about today.
Thanks, Nicola. I appreciate that. Now we'll go from one set of slides that said what the talk is to my set of slides, which say what the talk is, which looks almost the same as yours. The only difference I could perceive is the lack of the ARDC logo, so I'm not branding. I looked up the rules for using the ANU's logo, and then I stopped because there seemed to be way too many rules. And we'll talk about rules a little bit as we go along. So that's something to think about. You also had me down as Michael A. Martin, which is indeed my middle initial, but inspired by Bruce, I've decided to refer to myself now as Michael V. Martin, and not quite like Megan the Stallion, but we'll see how we go. And it is indeed true, I'm at the ANU. One of the really odd things about me, well, among many, is that as a professor of statistics, I may not be the sort of person that would normally be found on an ethics committee. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a penny ante philosopher, but certainly not one by trade. And my background is in mathematical statistics, so human research is not something I ever really did myself. But I found myself as the chair of the HREC at ANU by various circumstances, and found out that having a role where I learned something new every day was actually kind of fun. Leaving aside the torturous aspects of having to deal with people who are mostly cranky about what I was saying to them. But anyway, so that's a little bit of background on me. I've called the talk Human Research and Ethics Singing from the Same Songbook because one of the long-held beliefs that I've developed over the 10 years I was ethics chair is that human researchers often think of their research and of ethics as just completely different things. And this, to me, has been a giant mistake that's been made on the part of both researchers and ethics committees, which seem to always want to swim in their own stream and not too much let the streams intersect. But it turns out that good research is ethical research, and so the streams necessarily intersect if research is being done well and done properly. And so in that vein, we do all want to sing from the same songbook. It also gives me some confidence to think that we're all singing instead of shouting, which is sometimes what happens when human researchers and ethics committees get together. So we're going to start with a story, and this is a story you probably mostly know, but even if you don't know, it's sufficiently long ago that you might have forgotten most of this. But in 2013, there was a research study named This Is Your Digital Life, which collected data with informed consent, purportedly for research use or academic purposes. And the number of people who engaged in the research was almost 300,000 Facebook users, which is a very decent sample size, I might say. You'd certainly expect to get reasonable results from research like that. And it was monetized research. People were paid to complete a survey, which was called a personality quiz. So despite evidence to the contrary, people on Facebook often do have personalities and so can be quizzed about it. And when people logged onto Facebook, when they were paid for having done the quiz, behind their backs, although we'll talk about what behind your back means, uh, a bunch of significant personal information was also collected. Things like their name, where they were, and their contact details. And they were collected with permissions that were granted to them by the Facebook app. You know how when you install an app, I certainly know this happens on Android, you very often get this little palaver at the beginning which says, this app requests the following 400 things from you. Because mostly we're so keen to get to use the app, we just click OK. We tacitly accept this. So people are on Facebook, they accepted this, and so away went their data. Now, also behind their backs, because Facebook also had information on all of their friends. I should have put friends in quote because I'm not sure Facebook friends are actual friends, but nevertheless, all their friends had the same information collected, right? 87 million people roughly in total. So, 300,000 people sampled, but 87 million had data taken. There's a bit of a mismatch there. And of course, what consent existed for that? Well, the same sort of click-through consent that exists when everyone signs up for Facebook. But I would dare say that most people, if asked, would actually say no to this kind of behind-your-back data collection. Now, the researcher presented all this as being for research use and academic purposes only. And that researcher, his name was Alexander Kogan, not the guy who runs the grey market importer in Australia. And he was from Cambridge. And so the data collection was commissioned by a company named Cambridge Analytica, which almost no doubt you've heard of. The use of the Cambridge name is obviously very deliberate because it means that the research tends to then have an imprimatur. People think, well, this comes from Cambridge. That's cool, right? And of course, this all hit the fan when in 2016, Donald Trump was elected for the first time, and a lot of his prospects for election were influenced by the sort of marketing efforts that his team made based on data they had purchased and insights they had purchased from Cambridge Analytica. And this was all, of course, reported by The Guardian and the New York Times, or as they're commonly known these days, the failing Guardian and the failing New York Times. We all know where that's going. Okay, so let's think about consent because, if I'm sitting on an ethics committee and I'm looking at trying to get permission to a researcher to do this research, for instance, if I was on Cambridge's ethics committee, I'd be asking questions around consent, right? So let's think about the lines of consent for this particular research. It's certainly true that at the time of data collection, the overt data collection, Facebook users did provide informed consent. Now, informed is a weird word because it makes some assumptions that may or may not be true. Certainly some information was given to them. In this case, the information was partial and indeed probably incorrect. But even if you took at face value that the researcher originally intended for this to only be used for research purposes, it's certainly true that later on this was commercialized. And so the consent that existed was certainly violated if it was informed consent based on the information they were given. People were paid, so okay, they got something. But the information they were given was either incomplete, ignored, or so buried in the fine print that one could infer that people did not really provide informed consent. Okay. Now, we talk about fine print. We'll talk a lot more about fine print as we go forward. But every piece of research that gets approved by ANU's ethics committee, there's an information sheet which provides the information participants need. The information sheet often runs to 3 or 4 pages, sometimes longer. Certainly for medical studies, it can run very much longer. And, I've had a researcher say to me, he doesn't believe that any participants read the information sheet. There's a reason for that. It's long and it's boring, and it's got details in it that perhaps people don't really care about, etc., etc. Those details are there for a reason, but people have limited patience and time. So, there is a question, a live question, I think, about whether informed consent ever really exists. But in this case, certainly the information was deficient. It wasn't in fine print. The amount of information involved wasn't super much, at least for the overt data collection. So now there is that sort of black hole of consent that the 87 million minus 300,000 people who are friends fell into because they didn't know any of this was going on. So the lines of consent are at best blurred. So even though there was an informed consent process, only basic information was given. The use of the data was definitely not represented properly because the commercialization of the data definitely happened. The imprimatur creates a veneer of trustworthiness, which is interesting, right? I mean, we very often get asked, do we trust this company or that company? Most often I get asked, do I trust Woolworths? Do I trust CommBank? Do I trust Telstra? I'm a customer of all of them. So to some extent, I must trust them. I give them money every month. But, when push comes to shove, I probably don't trust any of them, at least not in some matters. So the lines of consent here are at best blurred. And there's a certain amount of the consent that was sort of behind a veil of secrecy, right? So the first question we might ask is, was the data collection legal? Now, this is also an oddly relative term because Facebook sits across multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, all of which have different laws, right? So, it's probably true that in the current Europe, where the GDPR is rampant, the data collection would not have been legal, clearly. Might have been legal in 2013, by the way, but certainly wouldn't be now. But in some countries, not only would the data collection be considered legal, it would be considered normal, right? And so, there's some real questions there. If you really want to get into the legalities of it, then there's this document called the Facebook's Terms of Service, which would outline exactly what data can be used and for what purpose. But my question for you guys is, if you're on Facebook, and I'm guessing most of you are on Facebook, if only because sometimes you want to look at something. If you're one of those rare people who's not on any social media, all I can say is congratulations, such a good life choice. But if you're on any social media, you've signed up to terms of service that you probably didn't read. And so I think in the modern world, we actually live in what I term blissfully uninformed consent land. We just have no lines of consent because it's all behind this veil. So you might think, well, what do these terms of service look like? Well, uh, here's a couple of little insights into this, and the URLs are here in case you want to look these things up yourself, because I know we're recording, and so you can go to these websites later. The New York Times published an article where they'd read 150 privacy policies, which is part of the terms of service, not all of it, part of it. The New York Times said they were an incomprehensible disaster, so we'll go with that. And then there was actually this art exhibition where what they did was they actually put the terms of service, they printed them all out on different coloured bits of papers and produced this rather awesome looking bar chart, which went down the wall and onto the floor and so on. And this is basically what you'd have to read if you were actually going to have informed consent to use any of these products. Remarkably, if you look carefully at the picture, and I don't know if you can see it as well as I can, the longest one is Instagram, which is interesting, right? So obviously those happy snaps that you've just shared, they've exposed you to quite a bit of something, God knows what. So what's going on here? What does this all tell us? And this was all, by the way, this was all before the current fetish of AI, right? Back then, there was certainly, and the good folks at Cambridge Analytica were doing what we might refer to as machine learning or deep learning, which of course is a precursor or part of the AI journey. But here we're talking about something that happened up to 12 years ago. And a lot has happened since then. And some of it's good, but some of it's not so good, as we shall see, right? So what's been going on, as well as sort of overt data collection through mechanisms such as Facebook, has been a really aggressive uptake of AI. Look, AI's awesome, right? In what other world can you sit on your computer and say, as I could today if I wanted to, write me a talk to give to the ARDC about human ethics, human research and ethics. I need it in 26 slides, please. Okay. And AI will go away and do this. Now, I actually did this. I actually did this. Now, that's not the talk you're at, because I looked at the slides and decided that it would be an almighty disaster if I actually used the slides that ChatGPT suggested. Well, actually, it was Copilot, right? And I thought, no, damn it, I'm flying this plane. So no. But, it actually did, it was serviceable. It was serviceable. This had me thinking that, AI is the new PowerPoint. So one of the things PowerPoint does is it takes a bad speaker and makes them look borderline competent. But for a good speaker, it almost certainly destroys them, because it ties you to this sort of stupid set of rules around, 12 lines per slide, yada, yada, yada. AI is the new PowerPoint because now everybody is producing crap that's been digested by ChatGPT before it goes out to the real world. So anyway, so how did AI happen? Well, it turns out a few companies, largely OpenAI to get started, but now everybody's doing it, basically needed data to train models. And where do you get data? Well, you just take it. It's a bit like Greenland, right? Just take it. We need it. That's it, right? We'll get it by any means necessary. Okay. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, hang on, you can't do that to Greenland. And you know what? You're right. You can't do that to Greenland, right? And really, you shouldn't be doing it to data either, because the data's not yours, right? It's not a free good. But harvested data was. Sorry for turning into Yoda there for a couple of seconds. Data got aggressively harvested by OpenAI and other companies from all sorts of sources, right? Meta, which is the company that owns Facebook, or as we call it, Zuckerbucks, they actually trained their model using the pirated library, right? A library of pirated books. And they did so on the basis that they thought every other company was doing it. So, if you want to start up your own criminal enterprise, this is your defense, right? I'm doing this because, well, other people are doing it, right? So, consent be damned was the attitude that they took rather. And so that's been great in the sense that it's delivered to us this amazing set of tools. But at the same time, these tools have been richly benefiting from the work of people who have not in any way been compensated, right? Uh, Most recently, just a couple of days ago, I think, ChatGPT brought out its new image capabilities, and people are creating images of unbelievable things. Now, they're actually more believable than you might think because, one of the things that all of these models can't do is actually invent anything. At best, they can synthesize things that already exist. That can create combinations that are, in a sense, new. But if you ask for an image of a certain thing, it's basically consulting its memory of things it's seen, which are things that perhaps are copyrighted by somebody else. So, okay, there's a problem there. The other thing that AI is doing, which is pretty alarming, is that nobody actually understands. Well, I say nobody. A lot of people don't understand what's going on under the hood. Okay, maybe the group I'm speaking with today, you guys do understand it a bit better than most. But for most people, AI is a black box, right? A bit like me and my car, right? It's a well, mine's a silver box, but it doesn't matter. It's a box. And I don't know how it works, right? I mean, I know some very basic things. In other words, I can do prompt engineering on my car to make it certain things work better. But if push comes to shove, I'm kind of stuffed, and I have to call the NRMA. So in recognizing these things, all I can say is, what could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? Well, here's something that could go wrong. Let's ask ChatGPT a question. Who is Ave Hjalmar Holman? So this is the answer. Ave Hjalmar Holman is a Norwegian individual who gained attention due to a tragic event. He was the father of two young boys aged 7 and 10 who were tragically found dead in a pond near their home in Trondheim, Norway in December 2020. Ave Hjalmar Holman was accused and later convicted of murdering his two sons, as well as for the attempted murder of his third son. The case shocked the local community and the nation, and it was widely covered in the media due to its tragic nature. Holman was sentenced to 21 years in prison, which is the maximum penalty in Norway. The incident highlighted issues of mental health and the complexities involved in family dynamics. Such a tragic story. The largest tragedy, however, is that it's completely false. Turns out ChatGPT was hallucinating. Okay. Now, what's it doing? How's it doing this? Well, somehow Ave Hjalmar Holman's name got connected with other bits and pieces of a jigsaw that has been put together to produce this answer, right? That's more or less how ChatGPT constructs answers to anything. It puts together jigsaws. Now, you've probably done a jigsaw. Some are easy, some are hard. If you've got a jigsaw of the deep blue sky with no clouds, probably pretty easy as long as you can fit the pieces together. Okay. If you've got a jigsaw that's rather more complicated, you might have a bit more trouble. Well, ChatGPT can have a bit more trouble. And this is something that's happened, right? So this guy has had this story told about him. And of course, it's all completely untrue. Now, what's his redress here? Well, the EU is sort of going after this and through the GDPR trying to get certain things corrected. But in the end, good luck with that, right? Because in the end, you're going to come up against Elon, right? And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And of course, AI is famous for not being able to answer simple questions like how many R's are in strawberry, for example. It couldn't work out, at least in early iterations, that that the answer is 3, not 2. So here are some other examples of data being used to train models without permission. Slack got caught doing it. Microsoft and Google have been caught doing it. And Meta, of course, is the one that I just mentioned, where a group of authors have said, "Hey, hang on, our books aren't yours to just grab." Sort of, we're about to face the digital equivalent of Me Too here. You know, this wholesale stealing. Okay, so you're going to say, well, gee, Michael, I'm here under false pretenses. I came to talk about research and ethics, and all you've done is talk about silly things like AI and Facebook and showing us silly pictures. What's this got to do with ethics? And the answer is all of these things come from the idea that research is meant to produce outcomes which progress humanity, which benefit people. Okay. And in all of the examples that we've talked about so far, one of the consistent threads is that research wasn't designed with the impacts on the people involved in mind, right? I mean, it's no accident that companies like Facebook have mottos like move fast and break things, right? Which is what has been going on in a lot of research that has been pushed forward through AI and other kinds of mechanisms. And look, AI is not the only bad guy in all of this, right? One of the bad guys that has really bedeviled human research going back through many, many years is the publish or perish principle that has dogged academia. This idea that getting stuff out the door is the goal, right? The only goal that matters. And so as soon as you forget about the people, you've lost the plot. And so there's a design principle here on research that needs to be thought about. And that design principle is that songbook from which human researchers and ethics committees can all sing. Okay. Now, you don't have to come to this talk to know what the 4 main principles are that govern human ethics. And by the way, if you didn't know what they are, here's some really good news for you. Just yesterday, the NHMRC released the 2025 version of the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. So fresh, hot off the presses, you'll be able to get in there and read about this. These 4 principles haven't changed. The updated version hasn't, suddenly turned everything on its head. The 4 principles remain: respect for persons, merit and integrity, fairness and justice, and then beneficence and non-maleficence. Do no harm. And I love the Latin for that, primum non nocere. Now, how does ethical research achieve this? Well, my thinking around this is that there's a social contract involved. When you engage with people to conduct research, there's a set of expectations on either side, and that set of expectations is what governs the informed consent process. You tell people what it is you expect of them, what's likely to happen to and for them based on what research does, and then they offer consent and their participation willingly and freely, on the understanding that you haven't lied to them and that harms won't come to them that you haven't at least presaged, right? And the social contract is not some monolithic thing. Respect for persons has many manifestations. Okay. There's some good examples of this, but the idea is that because the social contract is indeed social, it lives within a framework that depends critically on time, place, social and cultural and political norms, right? And so, one of the things that very often happened while I was the chair of the ethics committee is I'd have a researcher say to me, "Why are you giving me a hassle on this protocol or this project? Because something really similar was approved 5 years ago." To which my response always was, yeah, but 5 years ago, here are the 10 things that were different. And of course, 5 years ago for us right today is BC and AC, right? Before COVID and after COVID, because COVID changed a lot of stuff in the research landscape. So here's a couple of examples, and these actually did happen. I won't name names, but if you have research conducted in Australia, a survey that includes a question on gender, you'd be expected to include some non-binary options. But if you were to carry out the same research in Afghanistan, you wouldn't be able to get away with that. Now, the answer is not to say, well, I'll never do research in Afghanistan, right? Because respect for persons means that, people in Afghanistan also have a right to be heard, a right of agency, okay? So, you could put your hand on your heart and say, well, if I can't have that third option for gender, I'm just not going to do that research. Well, okay, maybe you're silencing people that just don't believe the same things that you believe. And there dies respect for persons. So, social and cultural norms matter. And you don't have to agree with them, but you have to understand them and contextualize them for the research that you're doing. I mentioned before COVID and after COVID, it's certainly true that COVID changed a lot of things in terms of the way research was conducted. First of all, everyone ended up on Zoom. Hello, we're all here on Zoom today. Some things take a while to go away. But a new normal started to apply in terms of the way you interacted with people. Okay. And so, the example that I mentioned earlier was that we had a research protocol that came to the ethics committee where there was an intention to ask a question on sex and gender that only included male and female. And the reason that they only wanted to have the binary, this is research to be carried out in Australia. The reason they only wanted to have the binary was they were seeking to replicate a study from the 1960s. Okay. And the ethics committee said, no, you have to have the third option. And the researcher railed against me. Well, I'll say me, against the committee. But a lot of the anger was expressed towards me. How can I do my research if I can't replicate a study, blah, 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 blah. And my response was pretty simple. It's if you can't replicate a study without disrespecting a group of people who have a right and an expectation that they won't be made invisible, then you shouldn't be doing the research. You can't enter a social contract if you are disrespecting the people that are involved. So it ensued that the third option was ultimately put in. There was a workaround. They were allowed to ask a question about assigned sex at birth, which is binary. Whether you believe that should be the case or not, that's the state of play. But they also had to ask a question that allowed people to express who they were as well. And as I say at the bottom there, don't get me started on privacy law, because there is an open chasm into which we will all one day fall. Perhaps ARDS has seminars on that every week anyway, right? All right, risk. Now, here's where being a statistician brings everything into my wheelhouse. One of the things that researchers so often said to me when seeking approval for their research was that their research carried, quote, no known risks. A lot of researchers often thought this was the way to get past the ethics committee. If I tell them there's no risk, they'll just approve it. Well, telling me there's no risk was an invitation to think about risks, and I could never think of none. And I use the double negative there advisedly. This makes me think of the song by REM, Everybody Hurts. It's a song, I don't know what you think of REM, but as I was preparing the talk, I had to listen to the song, right? Because preparing a talk can, it gets you wanting to listen to music sometimes. And I came across this cover by The Cause, which was just wonderful. Just wonderful. So anyway, it's got nothing to do with human ethics or research, but there's the link. Um, we'll bump up their count, but it was beautiful. So, and you know, my other comment on research ethics sorry, research and human ethics is that everybody, even researchers, deserve to have some joy in their day. Yeah. So let's try for that. So what I would say to researchers who told me there were no known risk is, go away and think about it, because there are. And they'd say, but then you're going to not approve my research. To which my response always was, look, I've been doing this job for a decade and I've only ever not approved two things. And I know we're recording, but those two things were objectively batshit crazy, right? So, hey, if you tell me there's risks and you show me that you understand them and you know something about how to reduce them, even if only a little bit, because you can't get risk down to zero, right? It only ever goes down to low, right? Look, the day you experience zero risk is the day after you died. Yeah? And so, you've got to take a realistic approach to this. Everything involves risk. That doesn't mean we stop living. That doesn't mean we stop doing research. It just means we try to understand those risks. So, when I go out into the real world, I don't go running around in the middle of busy roads because I understand the risks. But when I go running at 5 a.m. in the morning, I do run on the road because I know where my foot's landing because it's dark. And there's no risk from the cars because it turns out in Canberra at 5 a.m. I'm the only person out there, particularly in winter, right? So the risk still exists, of course. There are cars that still go by occasionally, but I mitigate them by, avoiding them. Yeah. And by the way, despite being a statistician for 100 years, I also am very bad at assessing risk, like most people. Most people worry very little about events like having a car accident, which are very common, and most people can't drive very well. But they worry a lot about getting on a plane and having a plane crash, which is insane because you know how many hours pilots have to put in? They really know how to fly planes. They know how to fly planes way better than you know how to drive a car. So, tricky, tricky. And there's lots of things that impact the way you think about risk. Okay, your personal experiences. So, for example, here's a silly example. When I was living in the US, when I first had to buy a car, I actually went out and I bought a Daihatsu. All right, um, not very common cars in the US, but once I bought the Daihatsu, I noticed them everywhere because I was driving one and I'd say, oh, there's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one. Very low prevalence on the actual road, but I think I noticed every single one that I saw. Meanwhile, I couldn't tell you what the brands of 90% of the other cars were. My experience guided what I was looking at and what I was looking for. So if you had experience of something like a particular illness, you worry about that more than if you hadn't had that experience. Publicity is really important. People think that if it's on the news, they ought to be scared of it. Generally, pretty good life advice, but not very good in terms of understanding risk. Certainly, risks can be framed to make certain events seem more or less likely than they really are. I mean, the big example of that that's probably on everybody's mind these days is migrant gangs in the US. Yeah, in real life, more or less non-existent, but they dominate the political zeitgeist, right? So, go figure. And it's all about framing. And of course, the element of framing there is the dread one feels. And of course, culture matters as well. Now, when you think about risk, and this is where the talk suddenly turns into my first year stats class, but only for one slide, so stay calm. Risk has two elements, likelihood or probability and severity or outcome. And one way to measure the risk, which most people would be aware of, is what's called the expectation, which is what happens if you take the probability and multiply it by the severity. Now, this, by the way, is the reason many people aren't very good at assessing risk, because people's notions of severity are very much guided by experience and things like fear, right? So sometimes people would place, almost infinite severity on certain outcomes, right? Which they perceive as being particularly bad for them. And if severity is infinite, then it doesn't matter what likelihood is, as long as it's not zero, your expectation is going to be high, right? And so it seems much riskier, okay? And you've probably all seen the old risk matrix approach to this, which is to put likelihood down one side and severity across the top, or vice versa, and then color everything in green, yellow, or red, the old traffic lights, to see whether you should proceed. And, that kind of makes sense. High severity and high likelihood probably means high risk. So you color that one red. I'm a bit, I don't like risk matrices, mainly because it's basically a coloring book approach to multiplication, which I think is part of the dumbing down of humanity. Might be better if you just understood multiplication. But, given that my experience of a lot of people in this world is functional and numeracy, maybe having a color-coded chart is okay. And I hope I'm not insulting anybody here with my rather colourful explanations of expectation. So anyway, there ends the statistics lecture. I hope that wasn't too painful for anybody. All right, now the next thing we have to talk about is a big word that is probably not so well understood, which is the word beneficence. Okay, I know it's a big word because it's got more syllables that I can reliably count while giving a talk. But it's really all about, well, most people are more familiar with its converse, non-maleficence, which I know sounds like something out of 101 Dalmatians, but non-maleficence is do no harm. So beneficence is actually do good as well, right? So you've got these sort of countervailing influences. Now, this is where every researcher has to look in a mirror and acknowledge something about themselves that may make them deeply uncomfortable, which is that every researcher has a fundamental conflict of interest. And that conflict of interest is embodied in the fact that if nobody participates in their experiment, their research fails. And so you have an interest in your research succeeding, which means you have an interest in people participating. And as soon as you have an interest in people participating, then your interests and their interests may not align. That is, you have a conflict of interest. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do research, because managing conflicts of interest does not require you to simply avoid them at all costs, which I know is what some committees seem to think is true, but rather to acknowledge, contextualize, and then manage the conflicts. So sometimes the conflict is mild. If the risks are low, then it's pretty likely that your interests and the interests of those with whom you're working aren't misaligned, at least not too badly. And sometimes they're very high. That is, if you're working in a very small population, okay, on a very tricky question. So the research has perhaps a lot of importance, but the potential risk for participants is very high, and so you might run into that issue, okay? So really the ethics process is all about, how do I manage that fundamental conflict of interest within my own research? And how do you do that? You show an understanding of, you show that you understand what the risks are, you understand what the impacts on people are, and that you can walk in the shoes of your participants to work out how to best conduct the research that delivers maximum benefit for minimal harm. And if you can do that, then you've achieved the calculus of beneficence. And here's where ethics committees can actually help you. We're not the enemy here, right? Ethics committees, at least certainly in my decade of experience, suggests that very often a conversation with the ethics committee can unlock ways to do research that researchers might not have thought about. Because methodology doesn't just exist in the theoretical constructs of a discipline. It exists in the broader construct of humanity, and ethics committees are there and can help. Which brings me to hands off my methods, which is what researchers very often tell me. So if I had a penny, well, you know how that goes, right? Researchers are always telling me, you can't get involved in this because I know my methods, I'm the expert and you're not. Okay. Now, I had two canned responses to this because I'd very often get called a fool by researchers. And I would say to them, sure, I'm a fool, but I'm the fool who's not approving your research. So that usually sat them down a bit. But my secondary response is somewhat more reasoned, which is, you know, I don't have to understand your methods to know that what you're doing is wrong, at least at some level, right? It's going to have the following impacts on people that you haven't mentioned in your protocol. So we got to mention them and we got to think about how to fix them. Okay. And then researchers would often say, but the ARC's already looked at my research and says it's good to go, right? To which my response is, yeah, but we're not looking at the same things, right? The ARC is asking, can it work? And would it be good for science if, or the humanities if it works? And the ethics committee is asking, if it works, how will it impact people? Not in that broad societal context, not in the context of increasing knowledge, those people, right? And you've got to marry those two worldviews in order to come up with a sort of complete picture of how research can go. So, you know, I don't see the research as a series of hurdles or a series of gates through which you must pass. I see research much more holistically. This idea that when you design your research, you can't just answer the theoretical questions, the technical questions. You have to think about how does it impact the people with whom I'll be working? Because those people, yes, we can call them participants, but in some sense, they're also your colleagues, your co-researchers. Sometimes literally, most often not, right? So we have to think of this in a continuum model rather than as a series of gates. And so one of the things that never worked very well was the idea that you'd write your ARC proposal without thinking about the ethics of your project. And then when it came time to get ethics approval, you'd simply copy and paste your ARC proposal into the ethics form as best you could and let the ethics committee untangle it. The difficulty with that approach has always been that the questions that you need to think about to get through the ethics process are completely different to the questions that the ARC wants to know the answers to. And there's a reason they're completely different. They're completely different because the world of theory is not like the real world. And ethics operates in a real world environment that you cannot necessarily have control of, right? So badly designed research treats these things as a series of gates where you have to get over the first one, then get over the second one. And it puts you into some sort of bind, right? Because we've had researchers who designed their research a particular way, got it approved by the ARC, got $1 million sitting in the bank waiting to be spent. And then the ethics committee says, hold on, you can't do it that way. And they go, well, if you tell me that, then I've got to go back to the ARC and make a variation on my grant proposal. Ugh. Well, okay. You've just designed a car that's a bicycle. What are you going to do? Or worse still, you've designed a car that's a fish. What are you going to do? Right? Now, researchers have choices. The first choice, which does seem to be one taken by many people, is to shake their fist and rail against the injustice of it all. It's the ethics committee's fault. You know what? It's not a question of whose fault it is. It's a question of taking a holistic approach to the way you conduct research. Thinking about the ethics committee as a friend rather than a foe. Being a friend doesn't mean I tell you you're right all the time, by the way. Your best friends are people who occasionally tell you you're not right. Okay. If you do have a friend that only ever tells you you're right, your name is Donald Trump and you're the most powerful person on the planet. Congratulations. And commiserations, particularly about the orange thing. Okay, let's get back to AI just to round out. I've only got a couple of slides left and then we can open it up. So the reason I'm getting back to AI is this notion of consent and how eroded it has become in the age of AI. Because we've now got this free good mentality about data available on the internet, which includes human research data that's been made available, plus pretty much any other information you can get your grubby hands on. This rise of AI has really weakened notions of what consents govern the use of data that already exists. So here's the thing. You think about something that you might call the data life cycle, right? And in the data life cycle, at the time of creation, data has a specific purpose in mind, and there's a specific set of consents that govern the use of that data, right? Then it gets put on the internet, and suddenly all bets are off. Very often, the data gets disconnected from the rules governing its use. Very often, the data gets disconnected from the purpose for which it was collected. Now, that second breakage is actually really, really problematic from a theoretical or methodological point of view, because very often the reasons that you collect data govern the kind of data you collect, right? Now, someone else is going to come in and go, oh, I can just use this. Well, what you have there is the recipe for the creation of an object like a spork, right? It's not a spoon. It's not a fork. It's kind of both, but it doesn't really work as either, right? Well, that's what the world has done to the commodity that is the set of data that you might be able to find. And of course, as we've talked about, AI has no idea what consents existed. And so they're just using the data because it's part of what was built into their modeling. And then, of course, they hallucinate, right? And those hallucinations themselves create risk. Now, there's a few elements to this which need to be thought about. First of all, human data, because it starts with the word human, is flawed. It incorporates errors of judgment, errors of measurement, bias, misinformation. Okay, all of these are inherent to the collection and retention of data. And if that just gets hoovered up to create the pool of truth from which AI draws, then guess what? The pool of truth is tainted. Okay. And of course, a lot of the data these days isn't even generated by humans, even though it looks like it might have been. So if you go on Twitter and you read a thread, about, I think, up to 60% was a figure that I read, is actually not generated by humans at all. It's bots who get in there and just say whatever the hell bots say, usually to push an agenda, okay, further biasing the stream of data. And of course, models just get, when the data comes into models to be trained, they don't know, is it real, is it synthetic? Although there are methods they can sort of use to work out if it's synthetic, but there's going to be a misclassification rate there anyway. And this leads to the potential for model collapse. Now, this is a lot closer than people think. So yesterday I was reading about one of the ingenious things that the company Cloudflare does. So you probably heard about Cloudflare. Cloudflare is this sort of web entity that sits in between you and the servers that you want to access. And they provide continuity of access for servers, right? And so web crawlers come in and they try to grab data from places that are guarded through or that are vetted through Cloudflare, and they pull that data for a training by AI models. But when the crawling is occurring, Cloudflare has this rather ingenious process of redirecting the crawler to AI-generated fake data, right? So they're basically deliberately tainting the pool. And this is to deter robots from coming their way, okay? Because what you're getting is poison. And of course, what you end up with is model collapse. Now, we're going to very quickly re-enter a statistics lecture because one of the things I tell my students all the time is this famous quote by a statistician named George Box: all models are wrong, but some models are useful. But the usefulness of models is a moving target. And people seem to want to interpret AI outputs as correct when many are simply and usually hilariously wrong. Okay. And here's something you may or may not have known. AI training processes that are used by the big companies, the OpenAIs of the world and the Groks, discard up to 90% of the data they're harvesting, right? Because the data is not useful for training. So they're very greedy and very wasteful. And distinguishing between human-generated data and AI-generated data in training is hard, and therefore there's misclassifications. So what happens is you get what I'm calling dilution, right? The original consents under which data were gathered have been diluted, often to the extent of being lost. Data integrity is diluted because the data on which AI models are being trained is this mix, uncertain mix of, or I call muddy mix, of human data and AI generated data. And then as the AI trains its models, the inherent biases and incorrectness and in hallucinations create this problem where, similar to inbreeding, where everything becomes the same over time. And so artificial intelligence, I'm now referring to not as AI, but DH, diluted humanity. And there's a paper in Nature from last year, which shows an example of what happens when you train AI on AI-generated data. So here we're looking at different breeds of dogs. You can see you've got the wonderful Pembroke Welsh Corgi, the Petite Basset Griffon Vendine. It's not a very common dog, as you might imagine. Dalmatian. Everyone loves Dalmatians. But then, of course, there's the common dogs. Beautiful golden retrievers. So when asked to generate an image of the dog, the most common dogs pop up most often. They get trained in as more probable. And so in terms of outputs, they are more often represented in outputs than less common dogs. Okay? Dilution. If you then feed in this next generation of generated outputs as inputs to training for future AI, the most common dogs now dominate not by a factor of 3 to 1, but a much less desirable factor. And so in your next set, you've got all Dalmatians. And then it starts to focus on features of particular dogs, and they get diluted further until what you end up with is not dogs, but some kind of childlike rendering of chocolate chip cookies. And so after generations and generations of AI data being used to train AI models, you get the ultimate in dilution, which is it's all gone. And this is referred to by the words model collapse. Now, we're not near that yet, but the speed at which we're going to approach it is going to frighten you because AI models are moving fast. Yes, they're breaking things, but they're moving fast. And the end result of this fast moving is what you see here. So, summary. What are the ethical problems that arise from AI? Well, muddied consent lines, diluted to the extent of becoming invisible. Data integrity issues. The data that you get may be very much unreliable or biased, which means beneficence might not even be something you can approach in the end. And then finally, the problem of data linkage. I think we're fast approaching a time where anonymity is going to become a historical artifact. People in the past used to be able to be anonymous, not anymore. Because even if you provide data that doesn't identify you, there are other data sets which also don't identify you, which when linked to the original data set will identify you through a process of what's called jigsaw identification. So who is Arve Hjalmar Holman? Well, that's who he is. He's a human. And by the way, he didn't murder anybody. Okay, this is my very last slide, which is my bonus reflections on AI chatbots, which is really more to amuse myself while I was rounding out my talk. I've used AI a little bit to answer questions. One of the things that astonishes me is how often they're wrong. They're very often wrong, it turns out. But when they are, they're confidently wrong. And when confronted with how wrong they are, they do apologize. In fact, they apologize profusely. It's pretty annoying. They try to correct, but more often than not, they're confidently wrong again, just in a different way. But then the kicker is they remind you not to rely on them. So what do we do when they learn to double down on their errors, which is what's about to happen? As soon as you start to enter the spiral that is model collapse, the errors become inevitable. And in fact, they become ubiquitous. Sound like anyone you know? Welcome to the post-truth world. And here we're going to take what Box said and we're going to think about what George Orwell said. The world in which all models are wrong, but none are useful. And for a statistician, that's my idea of hell. And so that's where we're headed. And then I went and looked up George Orwell's 1984, and it was all there. It was all there. Here, some 40 years later, 41, we can say the creatures outside look from pig to man and from man to pig and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which. And there'll be people who'll be sitting there going, yeah, Michael, that's wrong. That was Animal Farm. But I'm telling you, it's 1984. Welcome to the world of misinformation. And that'll do us. I've gone a little bit over time, for which I apologize, but I'm very happy to stick around and chin wag.
Yeah, I'll say thank you to anyone who has another Zoom meeting to run to. Thank you for joining us. I'm happy to stay and facilitate a couple of minutes of questions. But I'd also encourage anyone who's can't stay with us but has thoughts they want to share to pop onto the mailing list and start a discussion there. That's what it's for. And I think there's a lot of thoughts here to inspire some pretty insightful discussion. But maybe let's just do 5 minutes of questions now for anyone who's able to stay and wants to ask Michael a question or share an observation. I'll open the floor.
I managed to stun everybody. Oh, we have a question.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Michael, for your talk. So I work in a very interdisciplinary collaborative space, and sometimes I face the challenges that you've been outlining in working with my colleagues. And obviously everyone has the best of intentions, but how can we bring our fellow researchers on board kind of this exciting ethics train, if you will? Rather, like you gave examples about the ARC, my own approach is that the ethics is like, yes, you submit it, but it's basically like a living document that you keep returning to. It affects everything. So how can we encourage our colleagues to be more enthused?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. So the latest thing in research is this notion of co-design, right? And the reason I like that word is because it elevates design in the research process. And so the conversation I'd be having with collaborators right at the beginning is not how can we get this funded, which is what sits at the base of so many people's considerations around research, but how can we design this in a way that we can achieve not some minimal research goal, which is, bound to stupid timelines and dollar amounts, but which thinks about, again, holistically, the journey, right? So my threepenny framing of this is that this is a classic example of where the destination and the journey are completely different animals. And everyone's focused on the destination. But it turns out when you get there, all you're doing is getting on another bus to the next destination. That's such a flawed way to think about the way research should be. Research should be this continuum, this journey, and the next destination should be a question that arises out of good design from your original thinking. So I think the only way to do this is to have those conversations. The other piece of advice I would give for anybody thinking about applying for grants is before you apply for the grant, get in contact with your local ethics committee and just have a talk with somebody there about, what are the potential issues that might arise? How can we design in good practice, right? So these days, this is something I tell my statistics classes. At the end of the class, if you read the course outline, it says you will have a grasp of the following, techniques. I would love to just take the course outline and remove that entirely and say, I'm going to teach you good habits, right? Good habits. And the techniques I teach you will be part of that good habit thinking, right? So, I don't go to bed without brushing my teeth. That's a habit I developed. Now, if I had to think about it every day before I did it, I probably wouldn't brush my teeth nearly as often as I should. But I've developed this habit. So what I think researchers need to do is develop good habits around holistic thinking about their research and finding the human in human research and attaching that to the work, as opposed to thinking only about outcomes and dollars. So anyway, it's a hopelessly idealistic answer, I know, but
No, thank you. And sort of framing it around design is, yeah, like a helpful way to pitch it. Thank
yeah,
you.
well, if people think they're designers, they can at least, have a bit of flair about what they do. So
I'll throw it to Diane. I think we can take one last question.
Thanks for the presentation. It's great. And you kind of have answered my question, but I guess this is reiterating how common these questions are and how you respond to it is, doctors in hospitals will say, it's just QA. I've got rightful access and you're just killing these important projects. How do you respond?
Well, I respond pretty easily, which is, that's fine if you've got a captive population who have no choice but to be involved. And for some doctors, that's true, right? Because you've got people who would do anything to get out of the illness they're presently experiencing. But the moment you think about the people with whom you're working as a captive population, guess what? You're not doing human research anymore, right? You've lost the human. And if you're a doctor and you've taken that oath, you ought to hang your head in shame if you think of people as commodities, right? The medicine can't ever overtake the humans, because what's the point of saving someone if they're no longer got any agency, right? So I know that's a pretty challenging answer to the question, but that's my feeling about how you need to think about it. Put the human back into human research. And look, it's not the researcher's fault that people say, you are just an inflexible gateway through which we must pass, because ethics committees position themselves in that way also. We live in this uncomfortable space where we are both judge, jury, or each of judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to research. And that framework invites an adversarial response. If we could get away from that, we would solve 90% of our problems, right? So if we hung our shingle and said, listen, we're here to help, right? And no place has the ability to resource this kind of enterprise, but the ethics committee becomes your research partner, then we would solve a lot of these problems. Now, the fact that we don't have money that allows us to design our system that way speaks ill of us. But if you were starting from scratch, this is exactly what you'd do. You'd say, look, the research isn't about the reputation of some researcher who's going to be a level 7 professor at some point, right? It should be about what's the end game for people, right? But anyway, apparently I was born far too late to be in on any of these design decisions. So, and of course, no one might have listened to me. I probably would have been burned at the stake or something. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks, Alex and Diane, for the questions. Thank you again to everyone for attending, and massive thanks to Michael. As everyone in the chat has been saying, that was a really engaging presentation that I think has led to a lot of reflection from everyone here.
Can I just say one more thing?
Course.
Because if I don't say it, Bruce will kill me. We have a book, the Handbook of Human Ethics and Integrity in Australia. published by Routledge. Look, I'm not here to hawk the book, although it'd be nice if people took an interest, but it is a collection of articles by all sorts of really skilled and wonderful people that goes through a lot of different issues at this nexus. So I recommend it. Yeah. Anyway,
Thank
there you go,
you.
Bruce. Advertising delivered.
Give us a link and we'll share it when we share the recording.
Terrific.
So I'll just say thank you again to everyone, and I will see everyone at the next one.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michael.